For 250 years, Americans have tried to explain George Washington. We've turned him into marble, into myth, into the stoic face staring back at us from dollar bills and monuments. But who was the actual man behind the legend? Today, I'm joined by legendary historian H.W. Brands to talk about his new biography of Washington and the complicated, fascinating human being at the center of the American Revolution. This conversation gets into all of it. Washington's rise during the French and Indian War, the impossible task of holding the Continental Army together at Valley Forge, the aura and moral authority that made soldiers follow him into disaster after disaster, and the contradictions of a man fighting for liberty while holding people in bondage at Mount Vernon. But more than anything, this episode asks a question that still matters today. What kind of person was capable of creating the United States? Was Washington a military genius, a master politician, a reluctant revolutionary, or simply the right man at exactly the right moment in history? This is one of those conversations that moves beyond the mythology and gets us closer to the man himself. And honestly, after reading this book, I came away convinced that understanding George Washington might still be one of the keys to understanding America today. I'm Jason Herbert, and this is A Reckoning. My name is Jason Herbert. I'm a Southerner who lives in the West. I'm a historian, an outdoorsman, and a movie buff. I like finding new answers to old questions, and this is A Reckoning. So I got the email from Sarah when this book started making the rounds several weeks ago. She's like, hey, do you want to Bill Brands on? I was like, yes, absolutely. Why are you asking me silly questions? Of course, I have to tell you before we jump in too far, when I started getting into history years ago, your stuff was some of the first stuff I started reading back in the day. I'm sure you get this a lot, but it was fortuitous when she reached out. I was like, hell, yes, absolutely. Let's do GW, even though he was not the founder I named a child after. It'll still be okay. So that one goes to the spectacled bear over my left shoulder somewhere.
Okay,
else.
so do you have a Ben running around the house?
Or there's a Ben one over there somewhere. There's a Theodore Roosevelt a bear over here too. Nothing with GW though. So it'll be fun. My older son though and him fight vociferously over their favorite president because Jack, my older boy, is the biggest George Washington homer I've ever met.
All right.
He's in on this. The apples are not falling far from the tree. So man, I'm stoked to talk to you about this because I spent the last 3 days reading this book and just tore it apart and had a blast.
Very good.
Doing so. I got to ask you though, first off though, Bill, you've written so much stuff on all of these people. Why circle back to George Washington? Like, why now?
Well, I mean, the main reason is that I had been deliberately avoiding Washington. So Washington has showed up in several of the books that I've written. Mm-hmm. He was a big player in the book that I wrote on Benjamin Franklin, because, these are guys who run the show during the American Revolutionary War. And he, again, pops up when I'm writing about the formation of the party system in the United States, because he's first president. I wrote a book directly on the Revolutionary War, although I called it our first Civil War, and Washington's part of that. So he's been there, but I didn't really want to make him a focus. And part of it was I got in the biography business about 25 years ago as a result of a disappointing response to an idea that I pitched to a publisher. So I was young and ambitious, and my field is American history. And I thought American history is a big story and it deserves big treatment. So to this publisher, I said, I want to write a 6-volume history of the United States. And the publisher just sort of laughed at me and said, nobody writes these multi-volume histories and nobody would read them or buy them if we publish them. So forget it. So I was considerably downcast for a moment, but I still thought it was a good idea. And I kept it in the back of my head. And I decided that I would approach it differently. And I started off my history career as a high school teacher. And I know what high school teaching is like. And I know that a lot of high school graduates, and most people in America are high school graduates, they often have an unfortunate memory of their high school history class. And because, as I like to say, they can't remember the last name of their high school history teacher, but they remember the first name was Coach. and so it very often is the case. And I used to teach math when I was teaching in high school and community college as well.
God bless
and
you.
I knew that nobody, no high school principal or school board would put somebody in a math class who wasn't trained in math. You got to know something. But they have no compunction about throwing somebody into a history class if they're a volleyball coach or the football coach or whatever, because they figure anybody can teach history. They just have to read the textbook chapter the night before and hand out the workbook pages. So because of that, a lot of students remember history as boring. They remember history as these names and dates that didn't mean anything to them. And so I realized that the problem with my idea for writing a 6-volume history of the United States was I was calling it a history of the United States. What I decided to do instead was in fact, I didn't tell my publisher what I was doing. I decided I was going to write biographies. And my grand plan was to write 6 biographies that would cover the ground of American history from the 18th century to the 21st. And Benjamin Franklin was my first effort in that regard. And the Ben Franklin book got a good response. It turned out well. And so my publisher said, well, you want to write about somebody else, another biography? Because the thing about biographies is nobody has any previous inclination against biographies, because nobody had a bad high school biography class. The other thing is that biographies are the closest genre of nonfiction to fiction. And what you do in a biography is you do basically what novelists try to do, and that is put readers inside the heads of another figure. And we all like that. That's what literature and half of art is about. This is what movies are about, to let you know what it's like to be somebody else. And so biography is right down that alley. And I thought, okay, I kind of like doing this biography stuff. And so I said, okay, how about if I write a biography of Andrew Jackson? Now, the wheels in my head are spinning around quickly because I'm conceiving this as a history of the United States. I have to get overlap between my main characters, and I have to choose characters who can carry the story of American history. So I thought about including a writer or somebody who was in a different field, and it didn't work because this was going to be a history of the United States. Benjamin Franklin, I didn't think this was going to be a series of presidential biographies. And it didn't start out because Benjamin Franklin wasn't president.
Right, sure.
But after that, presidents are really handy because they're right in the middle of things. So then I wrote about Andrew Jackson. And then I left a gap because I didn't want to take on the Civil War yet. So I jumped, and then I wrote about Theodore Roosevelt, and then Franklin Roosevelt, and Ronald Reagan. I circled back eventually and did Ulysses Grant. So anyway, after I did those 6 big biographies, and biographies can be pretty big. My biography of Theodore Roosevelt was 900 pages, So I thought, oh man, I got to take a break from that. The other thing is that as appealing as a biography is to a reader, in some ways I found it frustrating to me as a writer because you cannot help contributing the impression that the world revolves around your subject. And you may be president of the United States, you might be Franklin Roosevelt in the middle of World War II, but the world doesn't revolve around you. And so it's hard to get in the other side of the story. So after I finished, the last in the series was my biography of Reagan. Okay, got me up to the 21st century. Reagan dies in 2004. So then I thought, okay, I cannot help writing about people in history. I'm not good at writing about trends and broad things, but I write about people, and I always look for people to hang my story on. So then how about if I write kind of dual biographies, companion biographies? And one of the first ones I did was about Harry Truman and Douglas MacArthur in their fight over the Korean War. And because it's very personal and I can develop these 2 storylines, but I get to do justice to both sides of the issue. And that one met a good reception. So I did a little bit more about that. And I did one on 3 members of Congress in the 19th century, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John Calhoun. And there you get this ensemble cast. I did one about John Brown and Abraham Lincoln and ways of dealing with slavery. And I did one about Charles Lindbergh and Franklin Roosevelt. But my publisher said, Bill, your straight biographies have really done the best. So how about writing another straight biography? And this is about 4 years ago when we started about this. And of course, one of the things you do in this business is you try to figure out, all right, when will this thing be published? And is there anything we can hang it on? So I'm looking for the 250th anniversary. And I finally decided, okay, I want to take on George Washington straight on. Because one of the reasons I had avoided writing about him directly is not that he had been overdone. I mean, there are books on George Washington, but because I didn't get him. I couldn't figure him out. And I thought, okay, well, if you're going to consider yourself a historian, if you're going to consider yourself a biography, your job is to figure him out. So I decided to take him on. So that's why I wrote about George Washington.
No, I dug this. And, as I was reading through the book, frankly, on the taxpayer's dime, I work at the Forest Service during the day. So, but, as a tribal liaison, so the whole discussion on Jackson, we can have some other time. But, I kept thinking about this too, right? As I'm reading the book going, who is this dude? Right? Because I'm less interested now. We've read so much stuff on the battles, obviously, Valley Forge and all these different things. And I keep circling back to this, like, who is this guy? And then some of the questions I kind of sent to you ahead of time, I'm trying to get at this idea. And I kept thinking about this as we were going along. Like, who does he talk to? Like, what's he thinking about? Because always, even, in every image we see of him is this super stoic dude, right? Mouth closed, principled. Yeah. And I'm just wondering, what's this guy talking about when he's walking down the halls? When he stumps his foot on the corner, does he curse? And trying to figure this guy out. And that was the part I think that I really enjoyed about the book, was really maybe a closeness to him that I hadn't read maybe some of the other stuff.
Yeah.
And I kind of wonder though, is there a difference in writing about George Washington that is different than, say, writing about TR or Reagan or some of these other titans in American history? What are the challenges that come with tackling this guy?
Well, I will tell you that I am very careful about choosing the figures I write about. So I'll give you an example. I did write a dual biography of William Sherman and Geronimo, the Apache chief. Mm-hmm. And except I focused on a particular aspect of their lives. It's not a full biography of Sherman. I call it The Last Campaign. It's about the Indian Wars after the Civil War. And with Sherman, he stands up to standard historical and biographical scrutiny. So he wrote a memoir, for example. And a lot of his letters, are still around because he was in the Army. There's time in the Army never throws anything away. So I can get at Sherman through his writings and the writings that are left behind. With Geronimo, not so. He did write a memoir. He's the only, as far as I can tell, he is the only important war chief from that period who wrote a memoir. Now, he didn't write it himself. He was illiterate. Right. He dictated it to somebody, but that's, ghostwriters, big deal. That happens all the time. But of course, a memoir, an autobiography, just tells what the author wants to tell. And so with Geronimo, there was a lot of triangulation of what he was doing at a given time. So he didn't necessarily say exactly what he was doing, but somebody else ran into him, or in fact, there was various people who rode with him who wrote memoirs, and so you get that part. But for the most part, I've chosen people whose lives, and this is answer your question, whose interior thoughts are well documented. So Theodore Roosevelt wrote 100,000 letters in his life, and most of them are still available. And this is key for the historian. I'm going to contrast Theodore Roosevelt to Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin became famous, but he was not always famous. And when people aren't famous, nobody bothers to save their letters. Nobody writes down their recollections of, I ran into Ben Franklin on the streets of Philadelphia today. No, because he's a nobody. And so in my coverage of Franklin, I spend 3 chapters on the last year of Franklin's life. I spend half a chapter on the first 30 years of Franklin's life, because there's just nowhere
Right.
enough stuff to do it. So, but for the most part, I mean, Franklin, there's lots on Franklin, there's lots on Jackson. Again, you get these famous figures, and people save their letters and they have these recollections. So there are intriguing people who have lived, but who are not very well documented. And I mean, Geronimo is the closest I've come to doing somebody like that. But you write about, for example, other Indian leaders, and you got nothing. So if you want to write about Sitting Bull, all you have are people who met him or ran into him. Or you could say, well, the Lakotas at this time were doing this, so Sitting Bull probably was doing something like this too. So I generally stay away from subjects like that.
Do you find it, as you're writing this thing, and I can tell you sometimes when I'm doing this with these questions, right? You're doing a bunch of press for this book, and a lot of my guests do, right? And you're sitting here going, what am I going to ask that's original? Do you find that in the same way in the book as well? Or just like, shit, I'm just going to throw my best shot out there and see if it lands, or what?
Okay, so I'm going to confess something to you that I don't really confess very often. And that is, I make a point not to read the other biographies of George Washington.
Thank you.
And the reason for this is, in the first place, there are too many. So there's that part. But the deeper reason is, to the extent possible, and I choose subject so that it is possible to do this to a very great extent, I work from the primary documents, the stuff that Washington himself put his hand to. I don't want to feel as though I'm interpreting Washington through the lens of another historian or biographer. And in addition to that, I don't want to feel as though I am writing sort of against somebody else's argument or in favor of somebody else's argument. I remember when I took history classes in college, and a lot of them were fairly standard history classes, and the professors felt obliged to devote the first lecture to historiography, what the historians have said about this subject. And that just put me to sleep. So let's get to the subject itself. Tell me the story of history. So this is what I try to do. And again, I'll refer to something I mentioned earlier. I think the most engaging aspect of history, and I think maybe the most important aspect of history, is putting the reader inside the head of the individual. Because I think history, being a subset of the humanities, is part of this grand project to figure out what it means to be human. So, I'm this one person who was born in the second half of the 20th century, and I'm living into the 21st century. I know what the world looks like to me, but I want to know what the world looks like to other people. And so the thing that got me hooked on history was reading old collections of letters and diaries written by the people themselves and autobiographies. And when I ran across, when I run across the letters of people, and I can imagine, okay, this person wrote this letter or this diary 300 years ago. And one of the puzzles, when I say, I'm trying to figure out what it means to be human. When Benjamin Franklin had a son, his first son, William, was an illegitimate child. And then he got married, and they had a daughter, and then he had a second son, Frankie. And Frankie died at the age of 4. And he died of smallpox. And he died in part because Benjamin Franklin, although a believer in smallpox vaccination, had just under the duress of business not gotten around to vaccinating Frankie. And Frankie died. So I remember when I was writing this section in my book on Franklin. And I wrote it at the time when one of my children was 4 years old. And I thought, okay, how would I feel if my 4-year-old kid died, in part because of something that I neglected to do? Now, I said, okay, that's a first approximation of what Franklin must be feeling. But is it the best approximation? This was a question I asked myself. Because in the 1990s, when I was doing this, in the 1990s, 4-year-old kids don't just drop dead. It's not as though, they're healthy one day and 2 days later they're dead. It happened all the time in the 18th century because half the kids didn't make it to their 5th birthday. And so if I had lost a 4-year-old child in the 1990s, I wouldn't have known anybody I could turn to who'd gone through the same experience. But with Franklin, half the people on the block did that. So it's, of course, painful for for a parent to lose a child. But if a lot of other people have the same experience, then you don't feel as though, why, God, did you do this to me? So it's this question. The basic philosophical question is, does human nature change over time? And I think it does to some degree. And so I can't automatically say that because I would have felt this way, that young George Washington in a similar circumstance would have felt the same way. It was a different time. But I think that's a way to get into the question. But then you ask the question, okay, George, how did you feel? Now, one of the great things for the biography of Washington is he kept a diary for nearly all of his life. Now, the biographer could wish that it was a diary in which he bared his soul. No, he mostly kept track of what crops had just been planted at Mount Vernon, and if it had rained hard, and how the oats were doing, and who is going to line up to repair the fences, and so on. So, but that very fact that that's what he thought was important to record tells me something about George Washington. So we historians, now, I have friends who are wonderful writers of historical fiction, and they portray a different past than I can portray. They try to get as accurately as they can. I think they're very responsible historical novelists. They don't make up stuff egregiously. They sort of fill in the blank spaces in the historical record. But I chose not that path. I can only write what I can document. And so, you pick your subject so you can do that. But then when the record is silent, you got to be silent too.
I felt that way, especially when you got into the war itself, and we'll come back to it in a moment. When you get to my old friend Thomas Gage, because I had flashbacks of being a graduate student, making my pilgrimage to the Clements Library up at the University of Michigan. I was writing on the Southeast at the time, and getting into those Thomas Gage papers, and you know what they look like, and you know how they smell, and it's kind of dusty, and it's just like, it's that stuff, And I remember I'm a Kentuckian originally, so seeing the Treaty of Henry Clay's Treaty of Ghent when I was up there, it's like, this is magical stuff that you're getting to look at. But I'm going to get sidetracked if I'm not careful. Do we get a sense, though, of who he was? First of all, your book made me feel another thing, which was old, Bill. I'm 48. I'm 49 in a few months, and everyone before George Washington is dying off well before then. And I'm taking the stairs one step at a time as I'm coming down. Do we get a sense of who Washington was as a younger man? I know when we get into the French Indian War, we'll talk about who he was, but as a younger dude, do we know who he was as a guy?
So George Washington really enters the historical record when he makes a surveying trip into the western part of Virginia. In fact, it's going to become Ohio, the Ohio country. And because he keeps a diary and he talks about this. And the first impression I had of George Washington is this guy who would, if Boy Scouts had existed at the time, he would have been a great Boy Scout, because he writes in this diary that he keeps about how the weather was cold and it was raining and then it was freezing and it was absolutely miserable, and he loved every second of it. So you got to think of him, first of all, as this guy who loves the outdoors. Now, that by itself certainly doesn't mean that he's going to be a soldier. But given the state of the military art in those days, you cannot be a good soldier unless you do well in the outdoors, unless you do well with short provisions, unless you do well being cold and miserable and everything else. And if you like it, then all the better. So you can basically rule out half the population who doesn't thrive under those circumstances. Well, they're not going to be military leaders. Now, we live at a time today when the generals are all indoors and air conditioned and all that other stuff. Although of course, it's important to remember, nobody starts out as a general. Well, except Marquis de Lafayette. But if you have that kind of money, it's a little bit different. But and so that's where I'm introduced to Washington, and it was a great introduction, because as I've said, I had included Washington in stories that I'd written about the past, but I never dealt with his youth, never dealt with the teenage Washington. And so by the time I get him, he's, usually already commanding general of the Continental Army. But the real question is, how does he get there? And how does he persuade people that he's the guy for the job? You talked about feeling old at the age of 48. Yeah, I mean, with Washington. And how do you characterize this young guy? Basically a boy wonder in the following sense. There was something about Washington that was very comfortable with making decisions and even taking command. So he was the commander of the Virginia Regiment. He was the top military officer of Virginia at the age of 21. So how does he do this? This is the question of, I try to see how the world looks through Washington's eyes, but I also then try to get in the eyes of other people around Washington. So what effect does he have on them? And this is where being the historian, the biographer, people who lived a long time ago, they're at a disadvantage to biographers, let's say, who deal with people who are still alive or are only recently dead. Because in some ways, I know more, well, in very many ways, I know more about Washington than any of his contemporaries did. I know more about Washington than Martha Washington did, because I read all of his letters and she didn't. She read the letters to her, but not the other stuff. But some basic stuff I didn't know. I can see portraits of Washington, but I don't really know the effect that Washington had on people when he walked into a room. I don't know the effect that he had on people when he rode up on horseback. He was the best rider that most people saw of that generation. And that was a time when being good on a horse was a big deal. It was almost the equivalent of being, a top athlete or something. And of course, horse riding is a form of athleticism. It requires that. But it was also something useful. But in addition to that, it conveyed command, because it sort of starts with, if you can command your horse, then you can command other people. And it's not coincidental that, especially in those days, generals rode around on horseback. So it put them head and shoulders and torso above the soldiers that they were commanding. And so there's something about that. So I want to know, I don't know what Washington's voice sounded like. I don't know what it felt when you shook his hand. And this is something that is, I really feel a deficit in this regard, not a deficit to other historians, we're all in the same boat, but to people who knew him. Because you mentioned Valley Forge early on. That was really the critical moment of the whole Revolutionary War. And I put it this way, he won at Valley Forge. He won by holding the army together. Mm-hmm. And the question is, how did he do it? It was really, he exuded a kind of moral force. And it's often been described as character. Yeah, it's character, but character can be almost a passive thing. So if I have an upstanding character, that doesn't necessarily emanate out, but he had more than that. He was the guy. He was a leader. He walked the walk as well. He hardly talked the talk. This is one of the secrets of Washington's success. He was a man of few words, especially a man of few spoken words. Now, he wrote lots of letters and he wrote orders during the Revolutionary War. So there's a lot for the historian to go on, but he's not spouting off. He's not giving speeches. And I concluded about Washington that really was one of the secrets of his success, because, a speaker can be a great speaker, but with every additional word that they utter, they sort of devalue the whole experience. Mm-hmm. With Washington, if he said 10 words, you hang on those words. A Daniel Webster or something like that would say 10,000 words. And maybe the 10,000 words add up to more than the 10, but still. And this comes out, I'll jump ahead a little bit, but at the Constitutional Convention, Washington was this towering presence at the Constitutional Convention, because of the fact that he didn't say a word.
Yeah.
He was the presiding officer of the convention, and he interpreted that as meaning that, okay, I say, time to adjourn, time to meet and that, but he didn't take part in the debates. And so he didn't lower himself to the level of all the other people who are arguing about this, that, and the other thing.
I think the youths, Bill, would call it aura farming. That's what my 18-year-old will say before he rolls his eyes and tells me I'm wrong about things.
Well, that really is something that I observed in Washington, and interestingly enough, that I observed in Ronald Reagan. Now, Ronald Reagan came at it from a different direction. He was an actor.
Mm-hmm.
And when he worked for Warner Brothers, one of the first things that they did is they sent them to call it sort of a celebrity coach, how to be a star. And this is the way you conduct yourself. This is the way you always got to know where the cameras are. You always make sure, don't think that you can say something off the record because it's never off the record and all this other stuff. And Reagan, the amazing thing about Reagan is it's impossible to find a bad photograph of Ronald Reagan because he always knew where the cameras were and he always knew to give it his best side and smile and all this. And so Reagan had this wonderful persona,
Mm-hmm.
but you can understand it because he was an actor. He was used to playing roles. Now, Washington wasn't an actor, but he did understand that he should present a certain character, a certain demeanor, a certain face to the world. Now, in some people, that would seem hypocritical. In some people, that might seem dishonest. But in Washington, it worked really well. Washington wanted the respect of his contemporaries. He wanted people to respect him and to admire him. And how did he do this? By doing the things that made a person respectable, by doing things that made a person admirable. So he established this standard for himself to live up to. So Washington never complained in public. He certainly never complained to his fellow officers. He would complain to his brother occasionally during the Revolutionary War. And he'd say that, the Continental Congress is not delivering all the stuff they ought to do, and the governors of the states, they need to do more. I'm going to confess something else here, that I and other biographers of Washington, we all suffer from the fact that when George Washington died, Martha Washington burned the correspondence between the two. So we don't know what Washington was saying to Martha. And who knows what it would have revealed. I think I'm 90% certain that the correspondence between George Washington and Martha Washington would not have been as revealing as the correspondence between John Adams and Abigail Adams. Because Martha Washington took no interest in politics or public affairs in the way that Abigail Adams did. And so we've lost something there, but I'm not sure how much, because, as I say, Washington did write to his brother, and he wrote to some close friends where he'd vent a little bit. But still, he presented this face to the world, and it was a face that caused people to respect him, to look up to him. It helped a lot. And this is a point that I make in the book, especially toward the end of the book. It helped a lot that he lived at a time when people were still willing to defer to their betters, as they were not disinclined to say. So Washington could set himself up on a pedestal, knowing that would work in his world. He was a member of the Virginia gentry. And although they were not aristocratic by English standards, still, these were the rich folks. These were and they understand, Washington especially understood that noblesse oblige was expected. So he didn't have to work for a living. He certainly managed the plantation, and that kept him busy all the time. But there were certain things that were expected of him. He was a vestryman of his church, for example. And so you were in this privileged position. This is what you were expected to do. He stood for the House of Burgesses, the Virginia legislature. And he didn't have any political ambitions, but this is something that you did. And then when your country, and he thought of Virginia originally as his country, when your country needs defending, you go to war. Now that's the thing that really appealed to him. That's where he saw, this is something I'm good at. And there's the telling moment, and other biographers, of course, have noted this. When his first action under fire, and he writes to his brother afterwards, I've heard the bullets whistle, and I can tell you there's something charming in the sound. And boy, if that's your reaction to being under fire, you got the makings of a soldier.
Isn't this immediately after he says, I just had 2 horses shut out from underneath me? I mean, he is right in the thick of it.
Well, yeah. And so, I mean, and one of the reasons you asked why I took on Washington.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm fascinated by different aspects of the human character and human nature. But one of the things, I have this, and I'm a historian, a history teacher, and a question that I pose to my students, and I pose to every audience I encounter, usually some point or other. I ask the question, why do we humans go to war so often? And, I will be giving a lecture, and I'll say, okay, I'm going to conduct a swift poll. How many of you like war? Just other things being equal, you'd like to see more wars. And nobody raises their hand. You think, what's this crazy idea? But then I say, well, okay, I think your view is pretty standard, but then how do you explain the fact that we humans are always going to war? And I'll focus on the United States. So Americans, I'm pretty sure, based on my polling of American people, Americans consider ourselves a peace-loving people. So how do you explain the fact that in the last 250 years, we've been at war more often than any other country in history? Where does this come from? Well, part of the answer, it's a multifaceted answer. So there are ambitions, and there are injuries done by other countries and all this other stuff. But one of the reasons is that in any generation, every generation, there are people who are good at war. George Washington was good at war. Andrew Jackson was good at war. Ulysses Grant was really good at war. Ulysses Grant is an example of somebody who wasn't good at anything else. He failed from one thing to another, and then the Civil War rescued him. And Robert E. Lee, Robert Lee famously said after the Battle of Fredericksburg, it is well that war is so terrible. Otherwise, we would love it too much. And with Washington, he was charmed by the sound of gunfire. Now, this, of course, brings up a big issue, and that is for historical figures, as much as they might think to the contrary, there's nothing inevitable about their success. So that bullet that zinged by Washington's head, it could have hit him in the head, and he would have died in his first battle, and we never would have heard about him. And so you got to survive, and especially for the ones who are soldiers. Ulysses Grant, in his memoir, was candid enough to say, when I was marching into my first battle, I was scared to death. And he said that if he had, this is an ironic thing for him to say, if he said, if I had been more courageous, I would have turned around and run. But the reason I didn't is that I couldn't stand the peer pressure, the peer disapproval of my fellow soldiers. So he just marches in. But he discovered something kind of like Washington, that once the bullets start zinging, once the shells start landing around him, it's like athletes who talk about being in the zone, where everything else fades away and they can just focus on this. So this was Grant. And Grant, in the middle of the worst enemy fire you could imagine, he's coolly giving orders, do this, do that. He hops on his horse and rides over there. And again, he could have been killed a dozen times during the Civil War. Washington, Now, typically, by the time you get to be a general, you are advised, don't get too near the front. We can't afford to replace you. But certainly as a young man, that could have happened. But anyway, this is if there's a single key to the success of Washington, and the thing that makes everything else possible is the fact that he was essentially born, or he was shaped by temperament to be a soldier and to be a military commander. He had this commanding presence. It helped that he was a big, strong, impressive guy physically. And he was head and shoulders above most of the people around him. There's that. He's a good horseman. So on horseback, he's even more impressive. But he was willing to make decisions. Again, this is something that is not given to all military commanders. Lincoln ran through 5 generals before he got to Grant. And finally, Grant was the one who could give the order basically to pull the trigger. We're going to go to battle. And Washington could do that too. Now, again, that's not something that's given to every person. It's a good thing that it's not. But Washington can order a battle knowing he could walk around among his soldiers the night before the battle and know that dozens, maybe hundreds of them are going to be dead by noon the next day and still give the order. Not everybody can do that. And it's a good thing. Not everybody can do it. We don't, blood will be flowing even more. But if you're gonna go to war, you have to have leaders who can do that. And Washington could.
Yeah, I think that there's a real great moment that when you're talking in the book during the Revolution, where Washington's saying, "Look, if you guys flee, I'm going to have you shot on sight." And I don't know that maybe the that the people who kind of generally come to Washington ever really get this sense of this. I mean, frankly, kind of a hard ass bill where he's like, "You're going to fight or you're going to die," and it's got to be, and he has, and I forget the man's name. The British spy executed as well. He's like, I'm going to sentence people to death. This is part of his business.
Yeah, and he didn't want to have to execute John Andrew, but they wouldn't give Benedict Arnold back. So, and this guy's a spy, so we're going to do it.
Okay.
You mentioned being willing to execute his own soldiers. So when there were mutinies during the Revolutionary War, and people had to be shot to make clear you don't get away with this. And one hesitates to put it in these terms, but you shoot a couple of bad guys, and then the rest he's serious. We got to obey orders. But the whole question is, how do you hold an army together? And you hold an army together in part by the positive example that you give. Here's Washington at Valley Forge. And he could have ridden back to Virginia. He could have said, enough is enough. But he didn't, and he stuck it out. He didn't leave during the winter. He's there the whole time. When other officers would go on furlough or something, he didn't. So he was there. But there also has to be, there's the carrot and there's got to be the stick. Because and it's not that the soldiers themselves were bad guys for doing this, but many of them were heartsick at the fact that their wives and their children were starving, and they want to just put some food on the table. But if you're in a position like Washington, you have to be able to make the decision, as much suffering as your family is going through, this is for the good of the nation. And we're all going to have to suffer a little bit, and people will die as a result of this. And one of the things that is so challenging about dealing with this is this requires the commander to do something that most of us are trained not to do from an early age, and that is don't use human beings as a means to an end. But that's exactly what the general does when he sends soldiers into battle. He knows some of them are going to die, but it's for this bigger cause. And you have to really believe in that cause, and you have to believe that it's going to be worth it in the end.
Do you sense that Grant is pulling from Washington here? Because when you say that, I'm thinking about, Grant would just send his guys in knowing this is going to be a bloodbath, and it's going to be a war of attrition. I'm going to punch and punch and punch until I grew up in the shade of Fort Donelson. So do you get a sense of that?
Well, I will tell you that every American general after Washington, in some way, every successful general, every commander, models himself after Washington in some degree. So Andrew Jackson, after the Battle of New Orleans, was often called the second coming of George Washington. Mm-hmm. And if you're at West Point, as Grant was, and then you're an officer in the Army of the United States, George Washington is the hero. He's the highest ranking soldier in American history before the Civil War. And even if you're Dwight Eisenhower, who had a farm at Gettysburg, you remember the Civil War generals, but it all points back to Washington. And this is, I'm going to anticipate a little bit, but toward the end of the book, I'm trying to figure out what is the secret of Washington's success. And I hate to work by process of elimination, but it wasn't that he had I can say that Washington was dumb or anything, but there were people who were smarter than Washington. Sure. Washington was smart enough. So it wasn't the smarts. He wasn't inordinately ambitious. Sometimes leaders have to have a lot of ambition to get ahead. Washington he was ambitious enough in the military line, but he really wasn't interested in politics. And he went into politics. He became president of the United States because people implored that he do that. But Washington had decided, as I mentioned earlier, he really valued his reputation. And he concluded as a young man that the best way, the surest way to make a reputation that you could stand by was to do the things that would cause people to give you that reputation. So he was somebody who, I'm not going to say he never lied, but he made decisions and he stood by them. He was often described by his contemporaries as he never rushed to decisions. He took his time getting to decisions, but by the time he got there, they were very well thought out and they were based on principle. And therefore, in having arrived at them that way, he wasn't easily budged. He was, in fact, almost never budged. Some of it is a little bit hard. I'll say this is one of the challenges I had dealing with Washington. So how did this guy become a revolutionary? Revolutionaries are people for whom the status quo, whatever the status quo might be, isn't working well.
I can see it for Sam Adams with this guy.
The status quo really worked well for Washington because, he's one of the wealthiest and most influential men in Virginia. So, by becoming a leader of the Revolutionary Party, he has everything to lose and not much to gain, except his reputation, because it was clear that the conflict, originally a political conflict between Britain and America, and I'll focus on Virginia here, as he was a Virginian, had come to a matter of principle. Now, in Washington really decided this is a principle, and a principle, if this is a principle, you got to be willing to fight for the principle. And especially, he's a soldier, and he talks about pulling out the sword and defending the principle with the sword. But then Washington does something. He casts this conflict in a way that to a 21st century observer says, really? So Washington says, if we don't take action against Britain, we will be no better than slaves. And come on, George Washington, you know what slavery is, and whatever it means for you, you're not going to be working under the hot sun in Virginia. And so is this just a figure of speech? Is it something that he wasn't thinking about? And that's what I originally thought. I said, come on, that's a bit rich. But then I realized, wait a minute. What is the essence of slavery? It's not that you have to work hard. It's not that your time isn't your own, but it is that you have to take illicit, illegitimate orders from somebody else. And Washington knew this. This is what slavery was about. And he wasn't going to be reduced to the condition of the people who worked his fields, but he was, and other Virginians, going to be in a position where other people controlled their lives. And he wasn't going to accept that. So this is one where, the language kind of gets in the way of understanding what Washington was thinking. But because, we think of slavery in a different way than they did back then. Anyhow, but so he does make this decision in favor of resistance. But, and this is a case where when those militiamen, the Minutemen at Lexington and Concord, when they tell the British, you're not going to take away our weapons, and this firefight begins, nobody at that time is thinking, okay, and now we're going to become an independent country. We're going to become the United States of America. But history, like life, kind of unfolds step by step, and one thing leads to another. And so I said earlier that Martha burned the correspondence between George and Martha. There's one letter she somehow or other overlooked. It must have been somewhere else when she was doing the burning. It's a letter that Washington wrote to Martha from Philadelphia in June 1775. This is the Continental Congress has met, and they're trying to figure out what to do. The fighting has broken out in Massachusetts, and the British are pinned down in Boston, and the militias of several of the New England provinces are up there. But the question is, what are we fighting for? And how will we know if we won? And so, but they figure, well, we don't know what we're fighting for yet, but we got to organize things. We need to appoint a commander who can organize the various groups. And Washington suspected that something like this might be coming up. And the way we know this is that when he left Mount Vernon to go to Philadelphia, he was wearing his uniform from the Virginia Regiment, his military uniform. He wasn't in civilian clothes, he was in military clothes. And in fact, he does get the appointment to become the first and only commanding general of the Continental Army. And so he writes to Martha saying, basically, honey, I told you I was going to be home in a couple of weeks. Well, it's going to be longer than that. I probably won't get home until September or so. And so this is in 1775. In fact, he doesn't get home until 1783. This 3-month conflict, this 3-month tour of duty becomes an 8-year project, an 8-year war. And so it's a matter of when the conflict begins, when Washington goes from Philadelphia to Boston to take charge of the fighting there, he doesn't know what they're fighting for. He knows that they're fighting against what Britain is trying to do. But what does this lead to? And it takes another year before the Continental Congress decides, well, this is going to have to be independence. And a lot of stuff happens in the meantime. But so in some ways with Washington's life, you can see the through line from when he's a young soldier, this frontiersman, and then he finally, becomes commanding general of the army, and eventually he becomes president of this independent United States. Some of that you can see, but it's a whole lot clearer in retrospect than it is ahead. So when Washington goes off to Boston, he doesn't know what he's fighting for. He knows he wants to acquit himself well. He knows that his country is at war and he needs to be at the front. And that's the honorable thing for a man of military background and talent to do. But he still doesn't know exactly what the end game is. And that's something just unfolds over time.
Every time I read A History of the Revolution, I am, first of all, continually shocked 250 years later that this thing gets pulled off to begin with. It's like watching a film and you keep expecting a different ending to happen, because I'm like, this is so unlikely. All of these things have to happen. The contingency, all of these things. I'm constantly shocked at how, and again, was reading this book, I just keep thinking like, wow, God, it feels at times like he's just holding it together. And I think maybe one of the things that you exposed for me, because I'm not a Washington specialist, I wrote my dissertation on Seminoles during this era, right? And I'm reading about this, I'm like, wait a second, Washington's got his own critics too. We tend to lionize him here in 2026. He wasn't there were certainly people gunning for his job. There were obviously people who didn't like the man. How does he deal with some of that backbiting? Because that gets exposed in the book.
Yeah. So what Washington realized early on was that he and the Continental Army didn't have to win the war. They just had to avoid losing the war. Because for Washington and for the Americans, this was an existential conflict, especially after the Declaration of Independence. They are now traitors, officially traitors to the British Empire. If they lose, they might get hanged as traitors, and the United States will go out of existence. So there's nothing more existential than that. So he's got to keep fighting. For the British, the war from the beginning was a war of choice. They didn't have to fight this war. And Washington understood, although he rarely articulated in this form, the American Revolutionary War was essentially a political contest. And the political contest was, can the Americans hang on longer than the British are willing to fight? Washington knew enough about what was happening in Britain. It's very interesting that a lot of this stuff is reported in the newspapers. And because a third of the American population was loyalists, and they were getting papers from England and all this other stuff. So Washington understood that support for the American war was not universal in Britain. And it had a majority at this particular moment, but that majority wouldn't last forever. And if the war dragged on, then eventually British voters, British taxpayers would say, we don't really want to keep doing this. In fact, the government that started the war might fall. That's what happened to governments and parliamentary systems. And a new government would come in and say, well, let's liquidate the war, which is exactly what happened. Now, Washington didn't exactly lay it out in writing in those terms, but you could tell that Washington never allowed himself to be put in a position where he might lose the army. And if a battle was going poorly, he skedaddled. He got out of there because he could afford to give ground, but he couldn't afford to give up the army. And this is why Valley Forge was the great single triumph of the war, because that's when the army could have simply dissolved. But it didn't. He held it together. And he gave up Philadelphia. The reason he's at Valley Forge, 20 miles outside of Philadelphia, is he got driven out of Philadelphia. He lost the battles there. Brandywine and Germantown. So he's out there. But another general might have made a last stand trying to defend Philadelphia and have surrendered the whole army, and that would have been the end of it. But Washington recognized, no, that's not it. Washington was a brilliant strategist. He knew what the overall goal was and what he had to do to get there. He was not a good tactician. And so there were battles that if Benedict Arnold, for example, had been commanding, that the Americans would have won, because Washington kept getting outflanked, and he didn't, he failed to recognize that there's this back road at Brooklyn where the British can get around behind him and nearly capture him, and he's constantly retreating. So he retreats from Boston to Long Island. He retreats from Long Island to Manhattan. He retreats from Manhattan to White Plains. He crosses the Hudson River, retreats all the way across New Jersey, until he finds himself in Pennsylvania. At which point, a lot of Americans, including some of Washington's subordinate officers, saying, "What's with this guy? He's all he can do is lose battles." And so there is talk that he ought to be replaced. And Washington was an astute enough politician to sideline these guys and to prevent the grumbling from getting out of hand. But he knew about it, and he had to deal with it. There were people that he would reprimand, and one of the great things about Washington was he had this force of moral character, and he had this reputation. And so if Washington dressed you down, you could be the most ambitious person, the most talented person, and you really took it personally. And nobody wanted to be on the wrong side of Washington. So when people are talking up Horatio Gates or various other people, Washington's, we'll deal with it, and I'm going to hold on. Another thing, and this is an aspect of Washington that is more subtle, and it's a part of Washington that doesn't get much play at all because it doesn't fit in with our idea of the dominating personality and the leader, the executive. Washington turns out to be a really good politician in dealing with the Continental Congress and the governors of the various states, because he recognizes he can't order them around. He can't say, he could say, we need more of this, we need more of that, but they don't have to answer to him. He knows that Congress, he's constantly writing to the president of the Continental Congress, and so it's John Hancock for a while, it's various other people. And he say, we need more of this, we need more of that. But it's not like he can exactly say, and if I don't get it, I'm going to resign, because he knew that the Continental Congress could not order the states to do anything. So in this regard, he reminded me a little bit of Dwight Eisenhower. Now, Dwight Eisenhower, modeled himself after Washington, but Eisenhower had to deal with Winston Churchill. He had to deal with Franklin Roosevelt. He had to deal with Bernard Montgomery. He had to deal with Charles de Gaulle. He had to deal with all these people.
Yeah.
And people he couldn't order around. That's the key here. Because if you're the commanding general, I think you can order people around. And for the people beneath Washington, you had no compunction by giving orders. But when you're dealing with your civilian superiors and what amounts to allies. So speaking of allies, when the French entered the war, he can't order them around. He has to make the case to the French that they got to get their fleet to the Virginia coast. And if they get the fleet to the Virginia coast in time, then he can trap Cornwallis's army and win a big victory at Yorktown. And now he didn't know that was going to end the war. He knew that if he captured that army, it would be a big deal. But all he can do is, he doesn't plead, but he explains why this is going to be in the French interest as well as in the American interest. And so he's very good at doing that kind of thing. And that's not what one associates with Washington, neither as a commanding general or when he's president of the United States. When you're president, you get to give orders. But there was that subtle side and this sense of, and then some of it reflected just his convictions that this is something we need to do, and I got to figure out how to do it. But he also, again, he had a force of character that made young men revere him. And so Alexander Hamilton became a son that Washington never had. The Marquis de Lafayette became a son that Washington never had. But every private and non-commissioned officer in the Continental Army felt the same way about him. Now, it helped that he was as old as he was, but neither older nor younger. So he was old enough to be the father of these people, but not so old that he might have been their grandfather. So he was still young and vigorous. He's in his 40s when this is happening. And so, and he can still ride better and longer than any of them. He can endure hardship more than any of them can. And he doesn't get to complain. They get to complain, but he doesn't. So his soldiers had this kind of reverence for him. And this shows up at the end of the war when the soldiers are spending the winter at Newburgh and up the Hudson from New York City, because the British are still in New York. The peace conference is still going on, so they still get there. And some of the soldiers are getting arrested because they haven't been paid for a long time. And they're talking about, well, maybe we should put pressure on Congress. Before the army is disbanded, let's go march on Congress. And Washington gets wind of this, and he he lets the officers themselves call this meeting. And so the meeting is going to be held, and then Washington shows up at the meeting, and it's the officers. And he essentially shames them into giving up any plan of doing anything except what was in their strictly military line of duty, because what he let them all know is that he would be very disappointed in them if they did anything but what was their military duty. And that sense of, my God, we don't want to disappoint General Washington, so we won't. And this whole prospective mutiny just dissolves. And in fact, many of the officers there, he does this sort of theatrical thing toward the end, and I don't know if he thought this through or it was just natural, where by this time he has to have glasses to read, and he's reading this statement, and he says he has to put on his glasses, and he said, I've grown old in the service of my country, and now I'm growing blind as well. And these soldiers who are just hot for mutiny and getting all the things, a lot of them just kind of dissolve in tears. And this effect that he had on his soldiers just made and spread over several months. This is what he did at Valley Forge. They stuck around at Valley Forge not because of the cause, not because of fear of retribution, but because they didn't want to let Washington down.
Bill, we talk about the greatness of Washington. I know that there's a danger. When I write about Osceola, I am just all about this dude. He was this amazing guy. And there's so many other people we can talk about. And then I've got to critique the guy as well. And obviously, we're going with this. We can't not talk about Washington as an enslaver, especially in 2026. How do we reckon with this, Bill? How does Washington view Africans and African descendants, people he kept under bondage and refused to let go until well after his own death?
Yeah. Okay. So the first thing is that if Washington did not own slaves, if Washington did not own slaves, and even if he had never had slaves, but if he had said, let's say in 1770, I think slavery is a bad thing, I'm going to free my slaves. In the first place, he could not have done that, and I'll explain why not. But even if he had been able to do that, then we never would have heard of George Washington, because he never would have been given command of the Continental Army. He never would have become president of the United States. This because he was a Virginian. And the people who are placed in positions of importance in Virginia were people who were successful in Virginia that other Virginians looked up to. The people who did not conspicuously disregard and criticize fundamental institutions of Virginia. So to be successful in Virginia in the 18th century, you were, of necessity, a slave owner. That's just the way it was. And even if he had said, okay, I think I'll run the plantation with free labor. In fact, he did try to do that when he was president. He was trying to figure out how to segue out of this. But if he had done that, his fellow Virginians and the important people in Virginia were slaveholders themselves. They would say, we're not going to appoint this guy. He must be a Quaker or something. He must be a weirdo. And so now this wasn't his thinking, but I'm just saying as an objective matter of history. I've said it actually. It's in some ways this conundrum is more striking with Thomas Jefferson, because Thomas Jefferson was sort of more reflective on all of this. And so Jefferson writes all these letters about how slavery is this horrible thing that we're doing. But of course, he has hundreds of slaves. And he writes that all men are created equal. So how can this guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence saying that all men are created equal, how can he be a slaveholder? Well, the answer is, if he hadn't been a slaveholder, he never would have been elected to the Continental Congress, and he never would have been appointed to the committee that drafted the Declaration of Independence. So if Washington had been converted to abolitionism, as a young man, maybe today, certain people today would have been able to feel, okay, I like this guy better. But you wouldn't even be thinking about him because he wouldn't have achieved the things that he did. So this is part of a larger principle. People are successful in their age, partly because of the talents they bring, partly because of what's unique to them, but also because they fit the times. And I'll say more about this toward the lasting legacy of Washington, but Washington had to fit the times. So that's the first thing that I'm going to say. The second thing I will say is that especially after the Declaration of American Independence, Washington is fighting for this country that is based on this principle, well, all men are created equal. He sees the contradiction. He becomes increasingly uncomfortable with slavery as an institution. He's trying to figure out how to get out from under it, but he can't for the following reason. The great majority of the slaves that worked the property of Mount Vernon were not Washington's slaves. They belonged to Martha, except they didn't even belong to Martha. They were held in dower for Martha's and her first husband's children. And so if Washington had been hit by a fit of conscience and said, I'm going to free the slaves, they weren't his to free. So there's that part. The second thing is that when Washington was a young man, there was almost nobody who was respected who said that slavery is wrong. Now, this is not to say that people were volunteering for slavery. They didn't think it was particularly good. They didn't think they wanted to be slaves, but they looked on slavery as one of those things in life that, nobody wants to die early of disease, but people do. I put a question to my students and audiences, and I say, is there anything we do today that 200 years from now, our great-great-grandchildren will say, God, that was horrible. How could you ever do such a thing? The way we treat slavery and slaveholders, because it's a real mystery, especially to my students, because they know, they've lived in a part of society that for 150 years has said that slavery is, the original American sin and all the really bad stuff. So how could any sincere person, intelligent person think otherwise? Well, I'm not going to explain that except to say that we are certainly doing things that our great-grandchildren say, how could you do that? And one I've often done exercises with my students. I want you to look at something that happens today that you think 100 years from now maybe even by the time you are grandparents yourself, that your grandkids are going to say, Granddad, Grandma, how did you do that? How could you do that? And I propose various things. War, for example, I mentioned that everybody thinks that war is bad, but we still go to war. Why so? And I think that's a fairly good analogy, where people looked on slavery. Washington certainly looked on slavery as a necessary evil. One last thing, you know, if the Virginians, for example, in 1770 had said, you know, slavery is not good for us, let's get rid of it. They lacked the legal and political power to do it. This is a big part of the Declaration of Independence. It's one of the complaints that Thomas Jefferson made against King George in Parliament, that he imposed slavery on them. That's pushing things a little bit too far. But it certainly was the case that if the Virginia legislature had said, we're going to abolish slavery, if they said this in 1770, the governor would have vetoed it, and the Crown would have said, forget it. They would have dissolved the legislature. So what Washington had to deal with was an institution that America inherited from Britain. And just as they inherited all this other stuff, they get to start over with this very stuff. And Washington was trying to figure out, how can we make the transition out of slavery? I'm going to say something here, and that is sort of immediately upon the Declaration of Independence, immediately upon independence, the northern states begin to end slavery. But none of them just wave a wand. None of them issued an Emancipation Proclamation. They all phased it in. And so Pennsylvania, with the first one in 1780, passed a law saying, okay, slavery is going to end. But if you were already a slave, you were going to live out the rest of your life as a slave. And this was in part because there was this whole society that was built around this expectation. And Washington, as I alluded to earlier, when he was president and thinking about retiring, he was trying to figure out, how can I rearrange things? And he was going to sell off some of his land. He was going to sell off some of the properties. And he wanted to sell them off and to emancipate the slaves. And because he was looking for a buyer who would be able to buy the property and could afford to pay laborers. Now, in fact, some of the laborers would have been the freed slaves, but it didn't quite work out. But he was troubled by the whole idea, but it didn't prevent him from playing by the rules of slavery as long as slavery existed. And this is something that's a little bit puzzling. I mentioned earlier that I wrote about Henry Clay. So Henry Clay was an opponent of the institution of slavery. He was from Kentucky, and Kentucky had slavery during all of Henry Clay's life. And Henry Clay conceivably could have said, okay, well, I'm just going to free my slaves, and that will absolve my responsibility in this. I'll feel better about it. But he realized that wasn't going to do any good because, well, in the first place, a freed slave in Kentucky, life wasn't a whole lot better than a slave because they would probably have to leave the state because the slave states had no room for free blacks. They passed laws basically making them leave. But secondly, Henry Clay said, it will have much greater impact when I am arguing against slavery if I'm also arguing against my own economic interest. I have greater legitimacy if I've got some skin in the game and say, okay, we need to end slavery, and I'm going to lose my slaves too in doing this, than if he had given up the slaves and say, now you guys give up your slaves too. Nobody would have listened to him. And so the best Washington could do, the best Henry Clay could do, was arrange for the freedom of the slaves under their control upon their death. One last thing, and in Washington's will, he makes this point quite clearly. When in his will, he says that the slaves I own will be freed not upon my death, but upon the death of Martha, because he knew something about the institution of slavery. Many of his slaves were married to many of Martha's slaves. And if he freed his, then he would be tearing apart this family. And because the freed slaves would probably have to leave Virginia. Furthermore, it would make Martha's life much more difficult because with all these free blacks around, they would be a temptation to the continuing enslaved blacks to want to flee, to no longer be slaves. And so he says this is the way we're going to do it. So the answer to the question is, in the first place, Washington and most of that generation didn't think that slavery was as clearly an unalloyed evil as we do today. Secondly, it was an institution they inherited and they couldn't get rid of all at once. And even the northern slaves, as I said, couldn't get rid of it. The states couldn't get rid of it all at once. So that's the answer to the question. So,
but we've been talking about all of these other people, these other men who fashioned themselves after Washington, people who were fascinated but influenced by, aspired to be. If we can play a game here and transport George forward 250 years, and he got to see the sum of American history, are there presidents that Washington himself would have said, I like this guy, I like what he's done? Who would Washington have liked?
boy, that's a tough one.
You're welcome.
Because there's nobody like Washington. I mean, there's nobody like Washington in public life. In fact, one of the points that I make in the book is that Washington was able to accomplish what he did because he was the last sort of his kind in America. When he died, one of his eulogists proclaimed of Washington, he was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Now, subsequently, when the Washington baseball team was called the Senators in the early 20th century, they were perennial doormats. They always finished last. So there was a sports writer named Grantland Rice who revised that statement about Washington and said, Washington, first in war, first in peace, and last in the American League. So spinning off of that. And the working subtitle I had in my head, it's not the subtitle of the book, which is just The Life of George Washington. But the thing that I was kept in my head was George Washington, first in war, first in peace, and last of his kind in America. I begin the book with a section on the Virginia gentry, the world into which Washington was born. And that was a very different world than the world of Republican, with a small r, America. So Washington was this man who, more than any other single person, guided America from colonial period to independence, from provinces of Britain to an independent republic. But he was able to do it in part because, as I mentioned, that successful leaders fit their times. So most of his times were the pre-independence times. And that's where he earned his reputation. That's where he gained his moral standing. That's how he became the person he became. And he lived at a time, he was commanding general at a time, even he was president at a time, when Americans were willing to look up to their leaders. They were willing to defer to people that they thought of as their betters. Another way of putting it is that Washington was a really good argument for aristocracy because he was the kind of guy that upper classes are supposed to produce. Somebody who has this command ability, someone who puts the interests of the community, in this case of the state and the country, ahead of his own interests. Washington lost a ton of money in the course of the Revolutionary War and when he was president. He was almost bankrupt by the time he left the presidency, but that was more important to him than his personal wealth. And so Washington was this model of somebody who devotes his life and energy for the good of the nation. That's not the people who followed Washington in this particular sense. For Washington, those people who are interested mostly in politics, they think if all this is leading up to Washington becoming president. And that's sort of the culmination of Washington's career. Not at all. The high point in Washington's career was the victory in the Revolutionary War. His presidency was a victory lap. It was a gift given to this guy for what he had done. Now, he's not unique in this regard because the same thing would happen to Andrew Jackson, Ulysses Grant, Dwight Eisenhower. But for Washington, it was becoming president added nothing, in his mind, added nothing to his luster, added nothing to his reputation. In fact, he was really worried that by becoming president, his reputation would decline. And so for Washington did not have to campaign for president. He did not have to compete for president. He's the only president for whom that was true. As soon as he decides to leave after his second term, John Adams has to fight with Thomas Jefferson to become president. So he helps create this republic. And a republic is based on the idea that people have different views and they get to argue about the views, they get to fight it out, and then we hold a vote and somebody gets elected and somebody doesn't. So for Washington's successors as president, they had to fight for the presidency. Washington had it handed to him as a gift. Furthermore, for everybody else, everybody after Washington, the presidency was this serious prize. Washington's ambitions were already fulfilled, already sated before he became president. And the presidency wasn't that big a deal. I should add something here. In the 21st century, we understandably think of the president of the United States as this is the job that anybody in politics wants. This is the top of the career ladder. And the president today is a way bigger deal than the president was back in the 1790s. Washington was not the first president of the United States. He was the first president under the new Constitution, but there had been a president of the United States before. This was the presiding officer of the Continental Congress. And nobody knows who they were because they were nobodies. And so nobody knew what this new presidency would be about. So it wasn't that big a deal. It wasn't worth fighting over. But it would become that in part because of what Washington did. But at the time, it wasn't that big a deal. In this regard, so a lot of people give Washington great credit for, at the end of the Revolutionary War, when the peace treaty has come, we've won, Washington goes to the Continental Congress and resigns his commission. And when George III, the British king, heard about this, he said, my God, he's the greatest man in the world because he has all this military power. He could make himself king if he wanted to. But the last thing Washington wanted was to become king. Political power did not appeal to him. But even if it had, suppose Washington had marched on Philadelphia and seized the government. There was nothing for him to seize because there wasn't a coherent government of the United States then. That's why the Constitution had to be written to create a federal government. He would have seized the place where the Continental Congress was sitting, but the Continental Congress had no authority over the states. And so it had no treasury. He couldn't seize a bunch of money. In fact, the national government was deeply in debt. He'd be taken on the debts. So even if he had wanted to pull up Napoleon Bonaparte or Julius Caesar and take over the government, there was no government to take over. And so it was a very different thing. When you first started talking about Washington today, I thought you were going to ask me the question that everybody asks. And so how would Washington do as president today? And the answer, he would have done terribly. Washington would have done terribly as president any time except the first two terms of the American presidency because he was not a Republican at heart. He was an aristocrat at heart. He expected that people would look up to him. But he was the last president that people were willing to look up to. So when people looked at Thomas Jefferson, we looked at John Adams, they said, he's somebody just like us. America was born a republic, but it really had in its genes a democracy that was just waiting to come out, where the idea of people really are equal politically. In a republic, you could have some people better than others, but that Republican phase really goes away almost as soon as Washington leaves office. So this is why I had this working subtitle, Washington, first in war, first in peace, and last of his kind in America. So Washington is always ranked by political scientists and historians in the top three of American presidents. It's Washington, Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt. And with Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, we understand the Civil War, World War II, the Great Depression, and so on. Washington, it's really because he was the first. And he's a victorious general from the Revolutionary Army, but that doesn't necessarily contribute to his accomplishments as president. But he's able to establish precedents. He'd do things that set the mold, but also a lot of the mold breaks when he leaves. And especially, as I say, if he had ever had to run for office, well, he wouldn't have done it. And so it's not as though there are not people like Washington today, but they just don't go into politics and they don't succeed in politics. They could become Secretary of State, for example. They could do appointed politics. They might become a justice on the Supreme Court. They might become a leader of a corporation or something like that. But politics in America is this competitive politics where we've got freedom of speech so you can say nasty things about each other. Washington was appalled at all the nasty things that were being said about him. And he thought, come on, I won the Revolutionary War for you guys. I didn't take this job because I wanted it. In fact, I volunteered not to take a salary from it, but you're making me take a salary. And so why are you taking pot shots at me? But people did. And when Washington decided to leave after 2 terms, it wasn't that he was thinking, oh boy, I got to leave now because other subsequent presidents will want to become president for life or something like that. He left because he was so fed up with politics, he could not stand another minute. He wanted to leave after his first term, but Jefferson as Secretary of State and Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, they said, you can't leave, we need you. And then he said, okay, I'll go for a second term. And those 2 guys then immediately left so they could go duke it out in partisan politics. Washington was appalled at how politics was evolving. And so he gave in his farewell address. And he said, come on, now listen, you guys stop this partisan stuff. It's going to tear the country apart. And if the country falls apart, then everything we did before. So in his farewell address, he says, stop the partisan politics and don't get mixed up in the wars of Europe. And then he goes back to Mount Vernon. And this is where it does seem almost sort of like fate steps in. If Washington had agreed to a 3rd term, and if his life had played out the way it did, he died in 1799 during what would have been his 3rd term. If Washington had been still president when he died, instead of establishing the principle that we're not having permanent presidents, we're not having presidents for life, instead of establishing that principle, he would have established the principle, yes, you should get elected and you should keep running until you die. And that would have been his legacy. But sort of because he was so put off about politics, he doesn't do that. And we get the other one, which is really much better for the United States.
I want to ask you this. As historians, we're kind of trained not to buy into the great man theory, right? We hear this and so forth. At the same time, we read books like this one here. And Washington, I think more than anything else, is a human more than a great man. But I want to ask you, Bill, maybe this is the final question here we can really kind of talk about. Because as I'm reading the book, I keep thinking about, oh, thank God he's here right now. Oh, thank God he's here right now. Oh, thank God he's here right now. Does the United States of America happen without George Washington?
Yes, but not then and not under the same circumstances. And the example, it's several times in the Revolutionary War, I mentioned, what happens if Washington actually loses the army? And what happens if the Loyalists, who were a real threat through much of this time, suppose they were the ones who gained the ascendancy? The United States does not become independent in 1776 or 1783. The United States remains a British colony. What would it have evolved into? And I say, just look north to Canada. Canada never fought a Revolutionary War against Britain. And Canada became, by the middle of the 19th century, the British realized this colonial stuff, it doesn't actually suit our interests anymore. The British became converted to free trade, and they decide, what we need really is friends and allies rather than colonies. And they get out of the colonial business. So to me, it's entirely possible that the United States might have evolved in the way Canada evolved. And, Canada is a great place. And in fact, Canada, I hesitate to say it looks like the 51st state because that's kind of a loaded term these days. But Canada is what the United States might very well have evolved into. I'll just add one other thing. And that is, if the United States had remained part of the British Empire, the United States might have been able to get out from under slavery sooner than it did. Because as a smaller country, slaveholders were a very much larger part of the polity. When slavery ended in the British Empire in the 1830s, when Parliament, way off in England, could say, no more slavery in the British Empire. If the United States had still been part of the British Empire then slavery might have ended in the United States. We won't call it the United States, but in the country that's going to become the United States then. And it would have happened without a civil war. So we would have eventually achieved essential self-government in North America. We might not have the same boundaries because of all the expansion that occurred in the interim. But individuals like Washington, you could take Franklin, you could take Lincoln, Grant, people like that. They are important in their moment. And if you want to explain why this happened, when it happened, then you got to focus on people like Washington. But they don't shape, or at least they don't determine, the larger influences of history. And the trends of history were eventually the dissolution of these colonial empires and the emergence of countries, well, under the forces of nationalism, where these countries they get their own governments. That would have happened anyway.
You spent the last few years working on this book. You've been circling Washington for a while. What happens next? Dare I ask who your eyes are trained on?
You can ask, and I don't actually have the answer to the question for the next book, but I will tell you that I've been amusing myself writing a Substack column. It's at hwbrands.substack.com, where I just take the opportunity. I call it a user's guide to history, where I'm looking at history, sometimes looking to see what history has to say for the present, sometimes just shiny objects in history that I think are interesting. So pretty much daily, I write 800, 900 words on something that is of interest to me. And apparently it's of interest to a bunch of people that follow. So that's what keeps me busy at the moment.
I tell you, my own Substack keeps me having fun. It's like, if as a historian, just write something. And I tell this to students. It's just like, just write anything. Write a love letter to your favorite restaurant. It doesn't matter. It's fun, right? And some historians will be thanking us for cataloging all this some years later. So, in the meantime, dude, I'm glad to finally get to meet you. This was a blast and fun to read. More fun to talk to you today. This was something I was really looking forward to. So thank you so much for taking the time. This was really, really great. It's a real honor.
Pleasure, Jason. Thanks for having me on.
And that's a wrap here at Reckoning with Jason Herbert. Thank you so very much to our guest, Bill Brands, today. Guys, you can find Bill's new book, George Washington, American Patriarch, at bookstores everywhere. Thank you so much to our producer, Fletcher Powell, for making this show run. And thank you to all of you for continuing to support this podcast. If you like what we're doing, make sure you share it on social media, share it with your friends, put it out there, retweet this stuff. Leave us some great reviews on Spotify and Apple or wherever it is you listen, and let's keep growing this together. Thanks so much for being here. We've got a bunch of stuff coming for you soon. Ciao for now.